Welcome to Poetry Lockdown, Day 102. I am bringing you one of my own poems today. So yesterday, I was thinking a lot about Peter, the character of Peter, and his famous denial of Christ, or that's how I read Anna Kamienska's poem that allowed us to really enter into his point of view. And then it made me think and remember I actually wrote a poem from Peter's perspective in my first book. And I know I've been reflecting in some of these poetry lockdowns about poems that you read, and then life happens, and all of a sudden you read them again and you go, whoa, there's another layer or level to that, or challenge to that poem that I hadn't considered when I first read it. And in the case of this poem that I wrote, it's actually like, oh, there's something there that I didn't know when I wrote it that I think speaks to now. So I'll leave it up to you to be the judge of if you think it's still speaking as eloquently as I think it is, because I'm biased. I wrote it. But any poet's got to have a healthy dose of self-confidence, right? So here we go. This is from the perspective of Peter. He's remembering the cleansing of the temple. And just kind of a word of like how I compose poetry that's in some ways talking to stories from the Bible. Like I've said many times, I like poetry that makes things that are familiar strange. So when I was thinking about this story, it just occurred to me, right? It was probably a little shocking and distressing. Jesus, right after entering Jerusalem, which the disciples, by the way, were not super excited about him doing, right? You know, you encounter some conflict from within our own religious tradition. Why would you go back there? One of his very first moves, at least according to the Gospel of Matthew, is to cleanse the temple of all the money changing going on, and he flips over some tables. And so this poem enacts that from the perspective of one of his disciples, Peter. So here we go. Peter remembers the cleansing of the temple. First one table, then another. His simplest advice, as easy as love your neighbor. So there we were in his father's house, tipping them over, clearing them with our whips of cord, imitating the master. To the mountaintop we'd come, and there, the stunned silence of a moment. Then crashing of coins, then gleeful beggars taking what fell, then the lowing of cattle and calling of birds, and all the while his form cutting through the mess like a general riding up and down his ranks. The surprise attack working, clearing out all the money, leaving behind the law and its one question: what sign can you show us for doing this? I don't remember what he'd said next, the lines that got written down. I know he said something, and then it was silent. Then the priest buzzing at his ears. Then we swept and swept over and over, the scratch of straw against stone. That was my poem. It's probably a dangerous thing for a poet to try to interpret his own poetry. Nevertheless, it's Poetry Lockdown. I'm going to talk about my poem. I know I've done a lot of what I would call kind of close reading. Yesterday I was talking about this idea of allusion in a poem. But I also think, you don't have to read a poem like you would in an English class all the time. And I say this as an English teacher. Sometimes you can directly say, like, well, what does this poem have to say to the world right now? And I'll be honest, when I read that, especially those last lines, right? When I wrote this poem, I know I intended for Peter to know that part of, after they had done this kind of overturning of making a mess of the temple, I also wanted in the disciples' minds and in Jesus' mind, we're going to clean up afterwards. And that's actually the last image. And I could not help thinking, right, living in Minneapolis right now, remembering my wife and I walking, to Lake Street and seeing all of these people, many of whom were protesting, right, the injustice of the death of George Floyd and all that went with that, cleaning up the city. And that was not something, right, that was what was reported a lot in the newspapers. And that image stuck with me. And also this idea of, many of the people who were following Jesus, zealots, were hoping this guy is going to go against the Roman Empire, right? He's going to speak truth to that power. And what a disappointment it must have been to those zealots to realize, no, actually, his first move is to turn against his own religious tradition and ask for a purification there. So that is in my mind right now as a Catholic and as a white Catholic. And I linked anybody who's listening to this video to a very, very powerful piece of writing by an African-American priest, Father Brian Massengale. I would really recommend all of his writing. He's written a book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, I believe is the title that I've read. It's excellent. But he recently wrote really a lengthy editorial in National Catholic Reporter. And one line in particular really stood out to me. I want to quote from it because it's something I've been sitting with. And he really is addressing white Catholics predominantly in this editorial, which is called The Assumptions of White Privilege and What We Can Do About It. He says, addressing us white Catholics, he says, feel the guilt, the pain, the embarrassment over doing nothing and saying nothing when you witnessed obvious racism. Stay in the discomfort, the anxiety, the guilt, the shame, the anger, because only when a critical mass of white folks are outraged, grieved, and pained over the status quo, only when white people become upset enough to declare this cannot and will not be, only then will real change begin to become a possibility. Wow. Those words are really challenging to me, as I imagine the cleansing of that temple was challenging to so many followers of Jesus. So that is where I'm going to leave y'all today. But thanks for engaging with my poem and Poetry Lockdown. Hope you all have a good rest of your day.